The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glare across the open-plan office. Clara's weathered hands hovered above her keyboard, trembling not from age but from the sheer force of restraint it took to keep herself composed. The beanbag they'd placed in her corner, a garish orange monstrosity that seemed to mock her 4 decades of service, had become the epicenter of a storm that was about to devastate the entire company. At 72, Clara had seen every corporate trend come and go. She'd weathered the dot-com bubble, survived multiple mergers, and even adapted to working remotely during the pandemic. But this was different. This wasn't just about comfort or modernization, it was a message, loud and clear: you're obsolete. They might as well have hung a sign around her neck reading, "Past your prime." Her eyes darted between the offensive piece of furniture and the group chat notification flashing on her dual monitors. Clara's corner makeover. The message read, accompanied by emojis and exclamation points from her 20-something colleagues who probably couldn't remember a time before cloud computing. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very technology she'd helped implement was now being used against her. She leaned back in her chair, her actual chair, which currently sat abandoned in the storage room, and felt the familiar burn of injustice rising in her chest. 4 decades. 40 years of writing code when computers filled entire rooms, of debugging systems with printouts, of building networks with actual cables. And now, because some Silicon Valley guru declared standing desks and flexible seating were the future, her professional space had been reduced to what amounted to a child's plaything. The worst part wasn't even the physical discomfort. It was the subtle shift in dynamics she'd noticed immediately. Younger developers who once sought her counsel now glanced at her setup and smirked. Her direct reports, many of whom she'd personally mentored, avoided meeting her eyes during stand-ups. Even the interns, fresh-faced and eager, seemed to view her differently, as if overnight she'd transformed from respected senior architect to elderly relic best left to quietly fade away. Clara's fingers found their way to the edge of her desk, gripping it tightly as memories flooded back. She remembered the first time she'd walked into this building 35 years ago, carrying a box of punch cards and wearing a dress suit that had cost her 2 weeks' salary. Back then, being one of the few women in tech meant proving yourself 10 times over, and she'd done just that. She'd built this department from the ground up, literally wiring the first network cables herself when the budget wouldn't allow for contractors. Now, those same corridors echoed with laughter that wasn't quite muffled enough, with conversations that suddenly stopped when she approached. The beanbag hadn't just changed her workspace, it had altered the very fabric of how people interacted with her. Each bounce and creak as she settled into its inadequate support felt like another nail in the coffin of her professional dignity. Her phone vibrated again, pulling her from her thoughts. Another email chain, this one titled, Office Ergonomics Initiative. Clara snorted derisively. Ergonomics indeed. She knew exactly what this was, a carefully orchestrated attempt to push her toward retirement without actually saying the words. After all, why would they need to maintain proper ergonomic standards for someone they clearly considered past their usefulness? The clock on her wall ticked steadily toward 3 p.m., signaling the start of yet another unnecessary team meeting. Clara watched as her younger colleagues gathered in the conference room, each settling into their adjustable chairs with perfect posture. She forced herself to rise from the beanbag, feeling its soft resistance give way beneath her. As she made her way to the meeting, she could feel their eyes tracking her movement, could hear the subtle shifts in conversation as she approached. For the first time in her career, Clara felt truly invisible, not because people weren't looking at her, but because they were seeing something she wasn't. They saw an old woman approaching retirement age, not the brilliant mind who had architected their entire infrastructure. They saw someone whose time had passed, rather than someone who still had so much to offer. And in that moment, something inside Clara snapped. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, dangerous certainty that things were about to change. As Clara entered the conference room, she caught sight of Greg, the newly appointed CTO, barely 30 years old, already scrolling through his phone while pretending to listen. His casual disregard sparked a memory from 3 months ago when he dismissed her concerns about their AWS architecture with a condescending smile and a pat on the shoulder. "We've got this, Clara," he'd said, as if she were a child who needed reassurance rather than the lead architect who had designed the original system. The meeting droned on, full of buzzwords and empty promises about innovation and disruption. Clara's mind wandered back to the countless late nights she'd spent ensuring their migration to AWS went smoothly. She remembered the sleepless nights debugging load balancers, the painstaking configuration of security groups, the intricate dance of setting up VPC peering connections. Every element of their current infrastructure bore her fingerprints, yet here they were, discussing optimizations that fundamentally misunderstood the very systems they were built upon. Her gaze fell upon Sarah, once her most promising protégé, now nodding enthusiastically at Greg's proposal to completely restructure their database architecture. Clara had taught Sarah everything she knew about database management, had stayed up until dawn helping her understand complex query optimization. Now Sarah sat there, eagerly embracing ideas that would introduce vulnerabilities Clara had spent years eliminating. The final straw came when Greg presented his plan for streamlining their multi-region deployment strategy. He proposed consolidating everything into a single region, for efficiency he claimed, completely ignoring the disaster recovery protocols Clara had implemented after their near-catastrophic outage 5 years ago. She remembered the terror of that night vividly, the frantic calls, the cascading failures, the realization that their backup systems were woefully inadequate. That crisis had taught her the importance of redundancy, of maintaining multiple fail-safes, of never putting all your eggs in one basket, lessons that apparently meant nothing to the new guard. As Greg wrapped up his presentation with a flourish, Clara felt the weight of 40 years of experience pressing down on her shoulders. These young executives, with their trendy tech jargon and slick presentations, were treating their infrastructure like a toy to be played with, rather than the complex, delicate ecosystem it truly was. They spoke of modernizing systems without understanding them, of optimizing processes they'd never had to build from scratch. The meeting adjourned, and Clara returned to her beanbag, her mind racing with possibilities. She stared at her monitors, where decades of accumulated knowledge waited patiently in carefully documented scripts and meticulously maintained configurations. 4 years, she'd kept detailed records of every decision, every workaround, every clever solution she'd engineered. At the time, she'd thought of it as good practice. Now, she realized it was her ace in the hole. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling not from age but from anticipation. She knew the exact sequence of commands that could reroute their entire AWS region through her local machine. It wouldn't take more than a few minutes to execute, and once done, every server, every database, every microservice would answer to her terminal alone. The power wasn't in making them pay, it was in showing them just how much they didn't know, how much they'd taken for granted. But Clara hesitated. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about respect. About making them see that experience wasn't something to be discarded when it became inconvenient. About forcing them to acknowledge that sometimes, the old ways were still the right ways. She thought about all the times she'd been talked over in meetings, all the suggestions she'd made that were ignored only to be rediscovered weeks later by someone younger, all the achievements that had been quietly erased from company history. The beanbag shifted beneath her as she adjusted her position, the synthetic fabric squeaking softly in protest. On her second monitor, a notification popped up, a reminder about tomorrow's infrastructure review meeting. Suddenly, Clara smiled. Not a bitter smile, nor an angry one, but one of pure determination. They wanted to treat her like she was obsolete? Fine. Let them learn exactly how obsolete she was. Her fingers began to move across the keyboard, not executing commands, but planning. She opened documentation files she hadn't touched in years, reviewed configuration settings she knew by heart, and started mapping out exactly how she would demonstrate her point. The beauty of AWS was in its flexibility, its ability to adapt to any situation. And Clara intended to use that flexibility to teach her colleagues a lesson they would never forget. As she worked, memories flooded back, not of resentment, but of pride. She remembered the first time she'd successfully deployed a load balancer, the thrill of watching traffic distribute perfectly across servers. She recalled the satisfaction of optimizing query performance, of reducing response times from seconds to milliseconds. These weren't just technical achievements, they were milestones in a career built on solving problems others deemed impossible. By the time the office emptied for the evening, Clara had crafted her plan. It wasn't about destruction or chaos, it was about education. She would show them the complexity they'd been ignoring, the vulnerabilities they'd been creating, the risks they'd been taking without understanding the consequences. And she would do it in a way that left no doubt about who had built the foundation they so carelessly sought to dismantle. The beanbag no longer felt like an insult, it felt like motivation. Tomorrow, they would learn that experience wasn't something you could replace with trendy furniture or dismiss with casual disregard. They would learn that sometimes the person sitting in the corner office, or the beanbag, was the only thing standing between success and complete catastrophe. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the scattered coffee cups and half-eaten bagels of another corporate day beginning. Clara arrived precisely at 7 a.m., an hour before anyone else would trickle in. The silence of the empty office provided the perfect backdrop for what she was about to do. She powered up her machines, feeling the familiar hum of processors coming to life, and logged into the AWS management console with credentials she'd memorized long before multi-factor authentication became standard practice. The first step was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She adjusted the routing tables for their primary region, introducing minute delays in packet forwarding. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to make services slightly less responsive. To the untrained eye, it would appear as normal network congestion. But Clara knew better. She was planting seeds of doubt in their supposedly perfect infrastructure. As the office began filling with the usual morning bustle, Clara initiated Phase 2. She activated a dormant Lambda function she'd written years ago, originally intended for stress testing their auto-scaling policies. The function started generating synthetic traffic patterns, mimicking the behavior of thousands of users accessing their services simultaneously. Again, nothing that would trigger alarms, just enough to make CPU utilization graphs spike unpredictably throughout the day. The real masterpiece, however, was her third move. Using an obscure feature of AWS CloudFormation that most engineers didn't even know existed, she created a stack that would gradually modify resource tagging across their entire infrastructure. Tags were the organizational backbone of their cloud environment, and by subtly altering them, she was effectively scrambling their asset inventory without actually changing any functionality. It was like rearranging the labels in a filing cabinet while leaving the contents intact. Technically everything still worked, but finding anything specific would become increasingly difficult. Throughout these manipulations, Clara maintained her usual routine. She joined morning stand-ups, contributed to discussions with carefully measured input, and even offered helpful suggestions when asked. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was simultaneously undermining and supporting the very systems she'd created. During lunch, she overheard developers speculating about the unusual behavior they'd been observing since early morning. Some blamed recent code deployments, others pointed fingers at third-party integrations, but none suspected the woman sitting quietly in the corner, eating her turkey sandwich while monitoring her handiwork. By mid-afternoon, the subtle disruptions had reached critical mass. Database queries that normally executed in milliseconds were taking several seconds. Auto-scaling groups were triggering unexpectedly, spinning up instances that quickly became idle. Monitoring dashboards showed inconsistent metrics, and the operations team was running in circles trying to identify the root cause. Through it all, Clara maintained her composure, occasionally offering vague advice that only deepened the confusion. The beauty of her approach lay in its educational value. Each modification she made highlighted fundamental weaknesses in their current architecture, weaknesses she'd warned about during countless meetings that had been dismissed with polite nods and empty promises. By experiencing these issues firsthand, her colleagues were receiving a crash course in cloud infrastructure management far more effective than any PowerPoint presentation could ever be. As the day wore on, Clara noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The confident swagger of young engineers began to waver, replaced by genuine concern and finally, outright panic. Support tickets piled up, incident response channels lit up with activity, and even Greg, the self-proclaimed cloud expert, looked visibly shaken as he tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding before him. Yet through it all, their systems remained stubbornly operational, refusing to completely fail but equally resistant to returning to normalcy. Clara watched with quiet satisfaction as her former protégée, Sarah, frantically scrolled through documentation she'd once helped write. She observed junior developers poring over architectural diagrams she'd created, searching for answers in the very blueprints they'd been so eager to discard. Each frustrated sigh, each muttered curse, each desperate attempt to restore order was a testament to the depth of knowledge they'd underestimated. When the clock struck 5 p.m., marking the end of the official workday, most of her colleagues remained glued to their screens, unwilling to admit defeat. Clara, however, rose from her beanbag with deliberate slowness, gathering her belongings as if preparing to leave. She paused by Sarah's desk, watching as the young woman struggled to comprehend the complexity of their DNS resolution issues, a problem Clara had solved decades ago using similar techniques. "You know," Clara said softly, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, "sometimes the old methods are still the best methods. And sometimes, experience counts for more than shiny new certifications." With that, she turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving behind a trail of carefully orchestrated chaos that would continue to unfold long into the evening. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Clara allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate the value of experience in a world obsessed with youth and innovation. But for now, she knew she'd planted the seeds of understanding in minds that had been too quick to dismiss her wisdom. The game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. As Clara stepped out into the crisp evening air, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The events of the day had been cathartic, yes, but they also served a greater purpose. She wasn't fighting against progress. Rather, she was ensuring that progress didn't trample over hard-won wisdom. The technological landscape had changed dramatically since she'd first entered the field, but certain truths remained constant. Attention to detail mattered, experience counted, and respect for foundational knowledge was crucial for sustainable growth. Walking through the parking garage, Clara reflected on how the corporate world had evolved during her tenure. When she'd started, mainframes ruled the data centers, and programmers wrote code on punch cards. Today, cloud computing had revolutionized everything, enabling unprecedented scalability and flexibility. Yet despite these advancements, human nature remained remarkably consistent. Young professionals still brimmed with enthusiasm, often dismissing established practices in favor of novel approaches. Managers still grappled with balancing innovation against stability. And organizations still struggled to properly value institutional knowledge. Her actions today weren't about halting progress, they were about guiding it. By introducing controlled chaos into their systems, she'd forced her colleagues to confront the reality of their infrastructure's complexity. More importantly, she demonstrated that mastery of technology wasn't just about understanding the latest tools and frameworks, it was about comprehending the underlying principles that govern system behavior. The subtle modifications she'd made to their AWS environment hadn't broken anything fundamental. They'd merely exposed the fragility that existed when operators lacked deep understanding of their systems. Clara unlocked her car, a modest sedan that had served her faithfully for nearly a decade. As she slid behind the wheel, she thought about the generations of technologists she'd witnessed come and go. Each wave brought fresh ideas and innovative approaches, but also a tendency to underestimate the challenges they would face. She remembered mentoring developers during the Y2K crisis, helping them understand why certain legacy systems couldn't simply be rewritten overnight. She recalled guiding teams through the transition from physical servers to virtual machines, explaining why change management protocols were essential even when everything seemed to work in test environments. The drive home took her past the city's skyline, where countless offices housed similar stories of technological evolution. In each building, experienced professionals worked alongside newcomers, navigating the delicate balance between tradition and innovation. Clara knew she wasn't alone in facing the challenge of remaining relevant in an industry that constantly reinvented itself. What set her apart was her refusal to accept obsolescence without a fight, not for personal glory, but for the preservation of hard-earned knowledge. Tomorrow, she would walk into the office and watch as her colleagues continued to unravel the mystery she'd created. She anticipated the moment when realization would dawn, when they would connect the dots between their current struggles and the warnings she'd issued over recent months. More than anything, she looked forward to the conversations that would follow, the opportunity to share insights, to explain design decisions, to demonstrate how experience informed every aspect of system architecture. Pulling into her driveway, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The beanbag incident had been a catalyst, but her actions today marked the beginning of something far more significant. She wasn't just fighting for her own place in the company, she was advocating for the value of experience in an industry that often equated innovation with youth. The technological landscape would continue to evolve, bringing new challenges and opportunities. But through it all, the lessons learned from decades of practice would remain invaluable, if only people were willing to listen and learn. As she unlocked her front door, Clara made a mental note to update her documentation tonight. There were always new lessons to record, new insights to preserve for future generations of technologists. Because in the end, true progress wasn't about replacing the old with the new, it was about building upon established foundations, respecting the journey that had brought the industry to where it stood today. And if that meant occasionally reminding people of their roots through unconventional means, so be it. The next morning, Clara arrived at the office to find an unusual quiet. The usual hum of keyboards and chatter had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the occasional frustrated sigh. Her colleagues were huddled around monitors, their faces etched with confusion and growing desperation. As she made her way to her corner, her beanbag now looking more like a throne than an insult, she noticed Greg pacing near the conference room, his phone pressed to his ear. Sarah sat nearby, her eyes glued to a terminal, muttering under her breath about inexplicable routing anomalies. Clara settled into her beanbag, deliberately making it squeak as she adjusted her position. She opened her laptop and began typing casually, as if nothing unusual was happening. Within minutes, her Slack notifications exploded. Messages poured in from every team: DevOps, security, infrastructure, even customer support. They all wanted answers, but none could pinpoint the source of the chaos. Finally, Greg approached her desk, his usual swagger replaced by something closer to humility. "Clara," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "we've got a situation. The AWS region is behaving erratically. Nothing's failing outright, but everything's off. We can't figure out what's causing it." Clara looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. She replied, feigning mild interest. "That sounds serious. Have you checked the routing tables? Or maybe the tagging policies? Sometimes those little details can cause big headaches." Greg blinked, clearly thrown off by her nonchalant tone. "We're checking everything, but it's like the system is fighting back against us. Every time we fix one thing, another issue pops up somewhere else." Clara leaned forward slightly, letting the beanbag creak again for dramatic effect. "You know," she said, her voice soft but commanding, "when I first designed this architecture, I built in safeguards to prevent exactly this kind of cascading instability. Redundancy, fail-safes, checks and balances, it's all there. But they only work if you understand why they exist, not just how to configure them." Sarah appeared beside Greg, her face pale. "Clara, we think someone might have tampered with the cloud formation stacks. Some of the resource tags are wrong. Like, intentionally misleading." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh? That's odd. Tags are pretty fundamental to keeping things organized. Messing with them would make troubleshooting nearly impossible." She paused, savoring the moment. Almost like whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clara, who smiled faintly. "Funny story," she continued. "Yesterday, while everyone was busy ignoring decades of institutional knowledge, I decided to run a few tests. Nothing destructive, mind you, just enough to highlight some gaps in understanding. Turns out, experience still counts for something after all." Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Wait, you mean you did this?" "Not destroyed anything," Clara corrected gently. "Just reminded everyone of the complexity you've been so eager to overlook. You see, when you treat experience as obsolete, you risk losing sight of the foundations that hold everything together. And when you replace chairs with beanbags without considering the message it sends, well..." She gestured around the room. "This is what happens." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, Clara. We didn't mean to dismiss you. We just got caught up in trying to modernize everything and forgot to respect where we came from." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "I know. It's easy to get dazzled by shiny new tools and trends. But innovation doesn't mean throwing away wisdom. It means building on it. What I've done here isn't punishment, it's a lesson. A reminder that the systems you rely on aren't magic, they're the result of years of careful thought and hard-won experience." Greg ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely contrite. "What do we do now?" Clara stood, smoothing her blouse. "Now, you listen. I'll walk you through every change I made, explain why each decision matters, and show you how to restore order. But more importantly, you're going to start treating experience as an asset, not a liability. Starting today, my corner gets a proper chair, and a say in every major decision affecting our infrastructure." "Done," Greg said immediately. "Whatever you need, Clara. Just please help us fix this." Over the next several hours, Clara guided her team through the intricate web of modifications she'd introduced. With each explanation, she watched understanding dawn in their eyes. Developers who had once dismissed her advice now hung on her every word. Junior engineers scribbled notes furiously, realizing for the first time the depth of knowledge they'd been taking for granted. By the end of the day, the systems were stable again, and the office buzzed with a newfound appreciation for the woman who had orchestrated the entire ordeal. A week later, Clara walked into the office to find a brand-new ergonomic chair waiting for her, along with a plaque mounted on the wall above her desk. It read, "Architect Emeritus, Guardian of the Cloud." Her colleagues greeted her with smiles and genuine respect, and for the first time in months, she felt truly valued. As she settled into her new chair, Clara allowed herself a satisfied smile. The beanbag incident had taught everyone a valuable lesson, not just about technology, but about the importance of honoring experience and respecting those who paved the way. And if anyone ever doubted her again, well, she still had plenty of tricks up her sleeve.